Well, now on Debunking Economics, we're going to look at the financial crisis. This is actually part 3 of our 2-part series. I think we said it was a 2-part series looking at the financial crisis, so we're on part 3
Well,
of a
that's
2-part
okay.
series.
This is, we can make it in honour of Douglas Adams. That's okay.
That's right.
If only he was alive today, he could write he wouldn't need to leave the planet to have a story about hitchhikers and losing the galaxy. And the planet being just devastated by the Vogon fleet. It's actually the Vogon banking sector.
Oh, right, okay. I was wondering how you're going to bring it back to that.
Yeah.
So, talking about the banking sector, well, I guess economists more than bankers. I mean, the financial crisis, I mean, given all the evidence we've had of what's gone before, why didn't we see this financial crisis coming?
Well, it comes back to what economists actually look at. Because if you were a person in the street, if you're a journalist reporting on what's happening with mortgages in Alabama and the rest of America, if you're a politician and you're dealing with constituents, you're picking up all these vibes about people in debt and shonky loans being extended and all that sort of stuff would worrying you. So you saw many commentators coming out, people like the guy who established iTulip, Eric Jansen, re-establishing it after shutting it down during when the dot-com bubble was over and restarting it during what was clearly the housing bubble. So many people out there were looking at signs and saying something big is coming. This is bad. This isn't going to end well. That sort of feeling was around. Economists on the other side, everything's wonderful, and the reason everything's wonderful is that economists, and this applies to virtually every discipline as well. Experts in an area are not experts on the actual topic. They're experts on a model of the topic.
Right.
Okay. Now, if the model is accurate, then there's no problem, and that's the great thing about science. So you look at, for example, what happened with the model of quantum mechanics. So we had every element of what's called the standard model except one called the Higgs boson. Okay. So then now we know that there was then a 40-year period of searching for the Higgs boson with bigger and bigger particle accelerators, and finally, only less than a month ago, we had the news they believe they've discovered the Higgs boson. So the model was accurate. They could find what they were looking at, and the people who are experts on the model could finally identify the missing part of the empirical data given a big enough experiment. Economists, on the other hand, they're experts in their models as well, but their models aren't accurate. Their models do not include everything that matters in the system in the same way that physicists have managed to do it. So the models that conventional economists look at, in fact, are so unrealistic that I've spent a 40-year campaign trying to point this out and destroy them because they are just dangerously delusional. And I could tell way back when I was an undergraduate student that if people actually believed this was reality, at some point there was going to be an enormous disconnect between what the models were saying and what reality actually did. Now, I didn't know that would happen in my lifetime. Obviously, Hyman Minsky thought the same thing, and he died 15 years ago. Wynne Godley thought the same thing, managed to see the crisis and then died as well. I have been one of the lucky ones so far. I haven't fallen over, so I was alive to see it happen. But their models, the models that dominated neoclassical economics, got worse over time, got more unrealistic. So, in about 35 years ago, the models shifted dramatically from being very unrealistic to absolutely delusional in what they called the Lucas critique, which was a critique about whether you could actually use what were called large-scale econometric models back at the time. And these models were models that attempted to predict the economy forward by statistically examining what had happened in the past and then projecting that forward.
Yeah.
And the Lucas critique said, well, in fact, what you get in the past data includes people's responses to policy. So if policy changes and people are rational in the way they define rational, which is, we'll get onto that one day,
Right.
their behaviour will change. So you can't use the past as a predictor of the future because the past has embedded in it what people's responses were. So what we need to do is to base macroeconomics on people's actual behaviour, what they called deep parameters. Now, this was a dive into the intellectual abyss as opposed to the figurative one that Cameron has done just recently.
So this is where behavioural economics comes into it?
No, even worse. If it was behavioural economics, it would have been okay, because that would have said, how do people actually behave? What happens when you add, one individual to another when they're very different, et cetera, et cetera. That could have given you a complex systems model of the world. Instead, they said, we're going to base our model on the behaviour of a single rational agent. One person. And that one person was the only worker in the system who they made a decision about how much to work now based on a labour-leisure trade-off between working now and having less leisure, and working less and having more leisure now but less income in the future.
Right.
And that worker owned the only firm in the economy, and therefore earned profits from that firm and decided how to invest based on the rate of return, and was the only consumer and consumed the only good produced in that commodity, etc., etc.
Right.
So they tried to imagine they could model the entire economy as one person.
Right. So it's too simplistic in a nutshell.
Simplistic is a compliment. Delusional is closer to it. Anyway, with that model, they therefore fitted that model to the data by working out what they called shocks, exogenous shocks, were necessary to make this model fit the data over time. And as that was happening in the economic real world as well, what we had was a cyclical tendency for the level of unemployment to not quite reach the same peak as the previous time before it went back down again, and inflation doing the same thing. So they're out of phase, but you had basically unemployment going boom, boom, like this, and inflation going boom, boom, boom like that. And they saw that happening, and they had these models which they thought were well grounded now. And they said, oh, what's actually happening is the great moderation.
Right.
That's what they called it, because everything was happening and getting less and less extreme, and the system was settling down and reaching equilibrium.
Right, that magic E word.
Magic E word.
But I mean, you can understand why they think that, because I mean, we do see it happening time and time again. So the dot-com boom that you mentioned is an example, surely. I mean, it was a catastrophe when it happened, but we recovered, and there was an industry that seemed to correct itself.
Yeah, the reason that it did seem to correct itself, and the same thing happened with every previous bubble. Now, if we tend to forget the extent to which Greenspan put his hand in there and did a bit of, let's not let this company go insolvent stuff for the banking sector. So that was a fiddle that they were willing to accept, because part of their model included the central bank intelligently choosing the rate of interest, so that if inflation was rising, they would increase the rate of interest by more than the increase in inflation, and that would then stabilise the system. So the model had the idea of workers' response to level of employment as part of it, the central bank's response to the rate of inflation, one other factor. There's basically three equations in their basic model. And then they would fitted that to the data. And of course, they completely ignored the thing that I worry most about, which is the ratio of private debt to GDP. Because according to their models, that doesn't matter. Okay. Now, I was looking at that and seeing this exponential process. So you might be seeing these two little inflation and unemployment things cycling down towards equilibrium, but here's debt going up like crazy.
Yeah, and they didn't know that because they weren't looking at that.
Yeah.
But is part of that because, I mean, you talk about Higgs boson and the scientific approach to problem solving. Is part of the problem that economists aren't scientists. I mean,
exactly.
they're finance people, and so they, as you say, they've been taught a way through university about a way to think, whereas a scientist would always presumably be thinking, well, are we right about this?
Yeah, well, there's an enormous tradition in science of, first of all, two things. There are very, very few pure theoreticians, but they do exist. But there's an enormous significance given as well to the experimental people who test the theories.
Yeah.
So like we know about Einstein's equations for general relativity predicting curvature of light around the sun. And I've forgotten the actual, unfortunately, the scientists who actually went and tested that. But the going out and seeing it, I think it was actually an 8%, or not degree, but 8 minute or 8-second bend of light around the sun from a particular star. I think it might have been Coddington. That was a major achievement. He was celebrated for that. Yep. So there's the combination where it's theory and empirical verification, but to an incredible level of precision. Now, economists say, we don't have the precision there. We can't do it as precisely. But they have a way of, before the event, saying, we don't need to worry about that. We can ignore that because that doesn't fit into our models. Well, that's really the unscientific bit. They invalidate an empirical observation on the basis that empirical observation isn't in their model.
So they're talking about a closed system that isn't closed.
Yeah, exactly. They've closed it. That's well put. We've closed it without genuine empirical closure. So I've been working on separate models as well, and rather than seeing the great moderation, I saw a crisis approaching. So that is the main hassle. They're experts on a model of the system. The model is incomplete. But even on top of that, their own understanding of the model is incomplete. What they think they know about the model is not what they really know. What the model really is. Because, for example, on the whole thing about can you model the entire economy as a single individual, that is justified in the textbook that dominated the education, I'll use that word very loosely, of neoclassical economists over the period from the 80s to the 90s, written by a guy called Hal Varian, called Microeconomic Analysis, and I think there's another one as well, but Microeconomic Analysis was the main one. And in that he said that he vaguely mentioned a problem in adding up the demands of two individuals. Vaguely mentioned it, and said the issues under which this can be done are rather technical, but a discussion is beyond the scope of this book. Now that's really, let's be hold your hand, don't worry, we've already worked it out. You needn't worry about that particular detail. In fact, when you look at it, what literature said, if you try to add up the demands of two individuals who both behave like utility maximising agents, as economists believe people do, you add them up and they've got demand curves like this. What you get is a squiggly line. And there's actually, in the research literature, it says any polynomial can be a demand curve resulting from aggregating two different agents. Now, that means if I draw these sort of demand curves for individuals, saying they're downward sloping, price falls, they buy more, that's a very restricted polynomial because it must be one which heads down over time. So if you look at the coefficients you can put against it, you've got rules about the coefficients. But if you say any polynomial, you know what a polynomial looks like, x to the 37th, bringing you all over the place, that could be a demand curve.
No.
Now, if they did that, they knew they couldn't model the entire economy as one agent, but they thought they could. So they're not even experts on their own model.
Right.
And that's the bizarre thing.
So a final point for this segment then.
Yeah.
It seems to me that it's complicated. So the whole thing's complicated. So everyone's trying to say, well, how do we chunk it down into something that we can understand?
Yeah.
And then your point is, well, if you do that, of course, you might miss out a vital element.
That's right.
But you're saying, well, one of those elements is the debt to GDP ratio, and that's a crucial element. Aren't you sort of doing the same? If it's complicated, you're saying, but here's the key indicator that we need to
That's
track.
a very good point. And again, the real thing we need to do, I think, in economics in general, is to get to the stage where we have a black box, which that black box generates the behaviour of the entire system. And if you can't, with your theoretical model, match the qualitative behaviour of the black box, then you haven't got a model of the system.
Right.
Now, in the general sense, the black...
So what's the black box? A more complicated model.
The black box is the real world. We simply don't know all the complexity out there.
Right.
So Minsky's approach was to say a Great Depression happened. If you have a model of capitalism that can't generate a Great Depression, then you haven't got a model of capitalism.
Right.
So my guiding light was that principle. I thought, perfect, that's absolutely true. Since it has happened, if you can't explain it, if you can't generate it in your model, then you haven't got a model of capitalism. So that rules out the whole neoclassical world. But ultimately what I'm hoping to do, and one of my PhD students is doing this right now, is building what's called a neural network model of the economy, which is literally a black box. I mean, you have a set of inputs, what are called hidden layers. Literally, that's what the expression, the way they describe it in the technical literature, of weightings between inputs to see how much notice you should take of them, generating an output on the other side, which is your prediction of how the economy will behave. And that's sophisticated enough, and there are other ways you can do the same sort of thing. What are called genetic algorithms could also do it. You would then have a system say, okay, here's 250 years of economic data.
Right.
Okay. Put it into the black box. Get to the stage where the black box replicates much that sort of behaviour, and then any economic model has to be able to capture what happens to the black box. If you feed in, like you have a increase in the debt level, okay, for example, then you see what happens on the other side of the model. If you don't get the same sort of response from your model, then you haven't passed the test.
No.
We need something of that nature
Yeah.
to start getting what sciences have, where you can develop a theory because you're trying to explain the empirical record.
Are we going to build this underground in Switzerland? Is that I mean, just as
I think it's probably better for most of the economists. But
well, I mean, a point to finish with. I mean, you mentioned at the very beginning Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Have you ever thought that perhaps that model exists and it's planet Earth, and this is just a big economic model for some species in some other?
Well, I've got a feeling
universe?
maybe the phone cleaning staff and the marketing staff actually came out here, and they're the ones that are teaching us economics.
Steve Keen, good to talk to you again.
Thank you.